I believe that every challenge a podcaster faces and every solution to those challenges can fit into three separate buckets: the content, the consistency, and the connection. And I'm going to go through what those mean and how these can help you to figure out what is the next step that you need to take your podcast to the next level. So content, consistency, and connection. So what is the point of all this? Well, I wanted to do this solo episode for you today because after 40 episodes of this podcast and after years of working with podcasting clients, just the challenges that I've seen podcasters face, it feels like there's a lot. It feels like there's so much to think about when it comes to podcasting. You've got your audio and microphones and all the technical side of things and the video and the cameras, and then you've got the content writing, so your title, description, show notes, episode titles, and you've got your visual branding, your cover art, your logo, all that kind of stuff. And then there's, if you're an interview podcast, it's booking guests, coming up with episode ideas, so all these different things. And then on the back of that, the marketing side of it. So making shorts, where you should post your shorts, if you should post on YouTube as well, email lists, blogs, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, which one of these things should I do? It can feel really overwhelming, especially if you've been podcasting for maybe a few months and you're hoping to start seeing some upward growth by now, but maybe you're still stuck on like a couple of dozen listeners, 50 listeners, and then it's kind of plateaued and you're not sure how to take it to the next step. So this is why I wanted to talk about these 3 C's of podcasting, so that we can really get clear on what these problems are and how to figure out which one to focus on next, because we can't do everything at once. If you do, then generally it's going to either cause you to get burnt out, or you're just going to be doing each of those little things, but a half measure of each, and none of them will really work properly. So let's break down what these 3 kind of buckets are and what exactly is entailed in each one. And then we're going to go into how to pick which one to work on for your podcast and why it's important. So the first one is the content. Now this one's kind of self-explanatory. So this is the actual content that you're making, the episodes. So what you're recording, is it an interview or a solo show? What microphone you're using, like the audio quality, things like that. The show notes, so how well the show notes are written, how well your titles are written to attract the attention of potential listeners scrolling through Spotify and Apple Podcasts. What exactly to talk about in your episodes, how to position your episodes to make sure that they attract your ideal listener and not just kind of a general listeners which aren't necessarily going to take that next step, whatever that step is that you want them to take. So the content side of things, again, it's a bit more obvious what this is. It's about getting your episodes kind of as good as they can be specifically for your ideal listener, and then the packaging around your episodes. So the cover art, the titles, the show notes, the video, the shorts, if you're doing those things. So that's the content. Then we have the consistency. Now this seems like a much smaller bucket, more sort of simple to get right. And you'd be right about that, but it's so important that I wanted to put it in its own separate thing. So this is how often and how sustainably you're putting your podcast episodes out there. So I've spoken with a lot of podcasters and they want to grow their show, and maybe they come to us for help, or just, hearing them on other podcasts or whatever, or just, scrolling through Spotify and I see these podcasts on there, and you'll see like, right, so they started on a Tuesday, first week of January or something. Then the next episode was on the Tuesday the following week, which is great, keeping that weekly cadence. But then they didn't release an episode for another 3 weeks. And when they did, it was on a Saturday. And then they're back to weekly. And then they release 2 episodes in a row the next week. And it's like, your listeners don't know when to expect you. They don't know if you're going to just disappear. They don't know if they're going to get 3 episodes a week and probably won't be able to actually listen to all of them because they don't have time. So that's one thing that's super important, and that's why it's got its own separate bucket. It's keeping consistent with whatever schedule you pick, and then also keeping consistent with that content that you're creating. So the content is sort of the quality and and how well it's targeted, but then the consistency is how consistent is that quality and that content. So for my podcast, for example, if I produce an episode every 2 weeks, then that's great and that's consistent in terms of the schedule. But if sometimes I was interviewing a podcaster, other times I was interviewing someone who's never had a podcast and they just happen to be a friend of mine and like podcasts or something like that, then the listener would be like, so is this podcast for me? Because I thought we were listening to podcasters to hear about their experiences and their insights, and now he's just talking to his mate or something like that. Or, if your podcast was a solo show and people really liked your show because it was a solo show and they just wanted to hear from you, then all of a sudden you started getting these kind of irrelevant guests or something like that. So it's staying consistent in terms of how many episodes you're putting out there. And then the third thing is about how regular your episodes are. So even if you stick to that consistent schedule, if you're only producing 1 episode a month, even if it's consistent, it's going to be very hard to scale your show. So it's the 3 things when it comes to consistency. It's the consistency of the actual content. Is it every time you release an episode, it's keeping that quality up? Consistency of how often you produce episodes. So if it's only kind of 1 a month or 1 every 2 months, then that's not very consistent. And then it's also just sticking to that schedule, whatever schedule it is that you do pick, whether it's every week, every 2 weeks, every 1st and 15th of the month. I know one podcaster does. Whatever that is, just making sure that you stay consistent with that. So that's consistency. And then the third part to this is connection. I just wanted to make sure I get those 3 C's in there. I could have called it community, which a lot of podcasters talk about, but not every podcaster wants to create a community. So the connection side of things is basically the marketing. So how are you connecting with people who could potentially listen to your podcast or your existing listeners as well? And this is around, what content are you posting where? Like, where is your audience? Where are your ideal listeners? Where do they hang out? And how are you connecting with them? Are you just posting shorts? Are you cold outreaching people, like finding people who could be potential listeners and DMing them? Are you sitting in groups, Facebook groups around your specific niche? Yeah, so it's really just how are you connecting with people and how you bring them into your podcast? Do you have an email list? Are you connecting with people that way? So any kind of challenge that a podcaster faces and any of the any of the solutions to those challenges can normally fit into one of these 3 buckets. So now that we've covered exactly what those 3 buckets are, I'm going to explain why that matters and how to figure out which of these 3 things, these 3 C's, content, consistency, and connection, you should focus on if you're struggling with anything in your podcast. So when it comes to podcasting, it's important not to worry about getting everything perfect all the time, because it's not going to happen. You're never going to be perfect when it comes to podcasting, and you don't have to be. Like even some of the massive podcasts out there, like Diary of a CEO, they're always talking about getting 1% better every time. So this is a podcast that spends millions and millions every year on editing, on research, on getting the biggest guests they possibly can. And even they don't consider their podcast like there's always, 1% better to get every episode. So that's the first thing to think about, that you're never going to sort of be there. Like, you can be content with how it's going, but there's always room for improvement. But obviously, if there are specific glaring issues, like if you're really struggling to get listeners, then you'll be aware that there is improvements to make. But where should you focus on to improve? So I talked about these 3 buckets. You could also think of them as pillars. So you've got the content pillar, the consistency pillar, and the connection pillar. And if you think about the podcast sitting on top of those 3 pillars, at any one time, one of those pillars might start to erode or crumble, or it hasn't been built up to the same quality or sort of condition as the other 3. And if you let one of them slide too much, if you let one of them erode too much, so for example, you're focusing on the consistency and the connection, so you're producing an episode every single week, the same time, same day, and you're sending that out to your email list, you're posting about it on social media, you're, really active in some of these groups that a lot of your ideal listeners hang out in. So you're doing all those things right, but then you're really neglecting that content side of things. So your audio sounds bad still. You're still using a cheap mic that you picked up when you first started. Your guests, maybe they're not ideal guests, or maybe your questions aren't really getting the best out of them. There's a lot of kind of rambling, and your episodes are going on for longer and causing people to tune out. So if you leave that pillar for too long, the whole thing kind of topples, if you can picture that. And then the same with the connection side of things. If you spend ages and on getting the content perfect, and you spend money on it and everything, you're consistent with it as well, but then you're not doing that connection piece, then it doesn't matter how good your episodes are, no one's going to find it if you're not making connections, and your existing subscribers might lose interest if you're not connecting with them and finding out what they like about the podcast and so on. So it's really about figuring out which of those three pillars are crumbling, like which is the bottleneck. And for a lot of people, that is the content. It can be quite difficult to convince yourself of that if you're enjoying the content. Maybe you're kind of in a circle and a few friends, they like your content, but sometimes it really is just that the podcast content isn't where it needs to be. And there are ways of figuring out which of these pillars are eroding. And I'm going to start with the easiest one, which is the consistency. So have a think about your podcast. When do you publish an episode? Is it fortnightly? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Is it whenever you get the time? Because I would recommend that your podcast should either be a weekly show or a fortnightly show, so every other week. If you're producing like these really documentary style, high quality 2 to 3 hour podcasts, and they're more like audio films, then maybe that would work as a monthly podcast. But I know that most of the listeners at the moment, or the viewers, aren't doing that. So typically it's going to be weekly or fortnightly, and then choose a day of the week. So typically I suggest Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They get the highest traffic, but you know your audience. And if that day doesn't work for you, then the more important thing is making sure it's consistent rather than getting that perfect day of the week or whatever. So this is a simple question you can ask yourself. Is the podcast consistent? And is the level of sort of quality and the style and everything consistent week to week? Because if it isn't, and you're just sort of producing episodes every now and then, or, as a lot of the guests on this show have talked about, and, it's one of the things that inspired me to make this solo episode, maybe you're struggling to book the guests, or you get guests that cancel, or you just feel like sometimes you just don't have the energy to record an episode, which I completely understand. But if this sounds like you, then that consistency piece is probably the thing that you need to focus on. I'm not going to go into all of the solutions for all these problems on this episode. Maybe I'll do some more solo episodes, or you can have a look at the other content on this channel if I've already covered it. But ultimately, you need to think about what's a schedule that you can stick to consistently, sustainably, that's not going to burn you out. And also thinking about how you can not let those other challenges, like not being able to think of content, like interview guests ghosting you on the day or whatever, how can you prevent those from actually being a problem? So is it bringing your schedule back by a month so that you're producing episodes much further in advance to avoid these issues? Is it batch producing? So when you have a day that you have a lot of energy, recording 4 to 6 episodes in that day. So then you've got a bank of them and you can stay consistent in case anything comes up. So from this, I hope that you can identify whether the consistency side of things is the biggest challenge for you, and if that's something you need to focus on. Then the connection piece is probably the second most easiest to identify. There's 2 ways about it. There's connecting with potential listeners, and there's connecting with your existing listeners. Now, I would personally, if you've got a few listeners, even a dozen or 2 dozen listeners, I would personally focus on making sure you're connecting with them regularly before seeking new listeners. Because if you get more and more new listeners and you don't have an ecosystem that allows you to connect with them, then they're more likely to just disappear anyway. So let's fix the podcast as it is before finding new listeners. But if you want to connect with your existing listeners, that means seeing if you can get them on your email list and sharing regular updates about the podcast or just regular content you think they'd find useful. It's creating content and documents and checklists and things that you might find helpful that you can share with your existing listeners. It's asking for their feedback. So whether that's incentivizing a review somehow or just putting together a Google Forms or something and sending that out and asking, or if it's your friends and family, just ask them in person. So making sure you're making that connection with them. If you've got a large listener base, 1,000 downloads an episode plus, you could think about, if you haven't already, putting together a community. So a Facebook group, a Slack channel, Discord, somewhere where listeners can gather and talk to each other, and then you can build that conversation around your show. And then that's that connection piece for your existing listeners. And then the other side of it is finding new listeners. So what are you doing in that area? Maybe it's nothing. And then again, you'll know that that's the pillar that you need to focus on. If you're already sharing 3 shorts every week, you're sending an email out every episode, you're hanging around in certain groups that have a lot of your ideal listeners in and providing value there, that you're connecting with other podcasters sort of adjacent to your niche and doing episode swaps and things like that, then the connection pillar is something you need to focus on. And then we come to the content pillar. Now, you might already know if your content isn't up to scratch, if you're not getting, if you really think about it, are you happy with the guests you're getting, for example? Are you happy with the content, the value that they're giving to you and your listeners? Or are you kind of letting them off the hook because you don't want to come across as mean and kind of funnel them down a particular way? Do you know that your audio and video quality aren't good? Like, are you recording with your sort of laptop webcam and a cheap microphone, or your laptop microphone or something like that? If you know those things are a problem, then it's probably worth focusing on that first before you start bringing in other people to listen. Because these days there are so many podcasts out there that you can't really get away with bad audio anymore, and you don't need to as well. You can find a really high quality secondhand microphone for under $50. And, if you've got a phone, you can set that up as a webcam, and you can get really high quality video these days just using your phone. Again, I've got a ton of content around getting good quality audio and stuff on the YouTube channel, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but if you know that that's a problem for you, then I would focus on that next. But why I said that this one's quite a difficult one to identify is because to you the content might be good, but are your listeners feeling the same way? And one way to identify this is not through how many downloads you're getting, but how long people are listening for. So if you sign into your Spotify, if you've claimed your podcast on there, or your Apple Podcasts analytics, you can sign in and you can see how long people are listening, and you can see how long people are listening to each individual episode. If they're dropping off after 5 minutes in general, or before 10%, then it might be that they're finding your content boring, or maybe it's just not getting into the action quickly enough. So you can use the analytics to tell you as well, and maybe have a look at your comments in YouTube and Spotify and that to see if there's any insight there. Then the other thing is, and this kind of pairs with that connection piece, is getting that feedback from your existing listeners, like getting them to really try and be honest about, like, if there was one thing that you would change about this podcast, what would it be? So not like rate this podcast out of 5, because a lot of people are just going to rate it 5 or maybe 4 to be polite. But if you say, like, if there's one thing you could change, or what's the worst episode you've listened to, what's the best episode you've listened to, and really trying to analyze the difference between those, and what people are really enjoying, what content people are enjoying. So there's a lot of different facets to this. You can also get a podcast audit. We offer podcast audits. Feel free to get in touch at joe@claricast.com, and I can have a look at your show and try and identify which of these pillars you should be working on to take it to the next level. You can also speak with just if you know other podcasters who will give you an honest opinion, and you can put yours in front of them. Then this will help you identify which one of these pillars to work on next. But if you have any questions, like if you want more clarity around like what these 3 pillars are, these 3 C's, then feel free to drop a comment in the comment section below if your podcast platform has one, or if you're on YouTube. Or again, feel free to email me at joe@claricast.com, and I'd be happy to go into more detail. But that's all for today. I just wanted to give you this kind of framework to view your podcast through going forward, and any challenges that come up for those who are struggling with knowing like which avenue to go down, what to focus on next, and to try and, I know we talked about a lot, but it's supposed to try and make you feel less overwhelmed. If you can just focus on one and be like, no, I'm not thinking about marketing right now. I'm not thinking about improving my audio quality, whatever. I'm just thinking about getting consistent. Then once we're consistent, then we can think about one of these other two things. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this episode, this solo episode. After 40 guest interviews, I thought it'd be good to reflect on some of what we've talked about. You can also let me know by email if you want to hear more of these solo episodes, or if you just want to keep the interview episodes going. I will be putting an interview out next week, again with another insightful podcaster. But yeah, thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you again soon. Thanks for listening to Podcasting Amplified. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. We'll be back next time with another conversation offering more insights to take your podcast to the next level and help you to achieve success. Happy podcasting.